Tonight, we begin with something the medieval world practiced with remarkable dedication, a soft, constant sense of quiet paranoia. Before we settle in, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you comfort or helps you drift off at night. And if you'd like, you can share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always strangely soothing to see the little constellation of places everyone is tuning in from, different corners of the world, all listening to this same slow story. So dim your lights, maybe switch on a fan for that steady, calming background hum, and let's ease into tonight's slow journey together with no rush at all. If you were a medieval king, the safest meal you could eat was realistically nothing at all. The royal kitchen was less of a kitchen and more of a medieval hazard zone, a place where every pot simmered suspiciously, every pan carried its own subtle risks, and every smiling servant might as well have been a supporting character in a very slow mystery. The cooks weren't just preparing meals the way we think of them today. They were, unintentionally, and on certain unfortunate days intentionally, conducting early experiments in what might be called accidental biochemical warfare. Imagine entering your royal kitchen, the place meant to nourish the most powerful person in the kingdom, and being greeted not by comfort, but by the layered, unforgettable aromas of boiling meat, bread that had burned just slightly too long, and that one fish whose time had clearly passed. Yet there it sat, defiantly, because someone insisted it was perfectly fine as long as the flies were brushed away. And this, keep in mind, was before the conspiracies even began. To protect themselves, kings appointed tasters, men who carried impressive titles that sounded noble and refined, until you realized the job description was essentially, "Please try this mysterious dish and inform me promptly if it kills you." It was a profession where simply surviving the lunch shift counted as a respectable promotion. These tasters sampled everything: soups, stews, pies, wines, with slow, deliberate care. If they lived, the king ate in peace. If they didn't, the king simply asked for more soup from the other cook, preferably one who appeared slightly less capable of murder. And none of this was exaggerated. Medieval rulers weren't dramatic, they were being sensible. Poisoning was remarkably common, almost a practical shortcut in a world where war was expensive, exhausting, and deeply inconvenient. Why gather armies and march for months, when someone could simply sprinkle something ominous into a bowl of porridge? Chroniclers claim King John of England poisoned at least one rival, which makes sense for a man who once managed to lose his crown jewels in a swamp. Poisoning a relative might have been the least chaotic part of his week. In the Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, food-based assassinations bordered on recreational. Courtiers traded poisons, the way modern children trade collectible cards. Some emperors didn't even focus on ruling anymore. They simply waited for dinner, clutched their stomachs with theatrical flair, and politely exited history so the next cousin could take their place. Even the papal kitchens were far from peaceful. More than one cardinal mysteriously collapsed just before an important election. Chroniclers chalked it up to the will of God, which, in the Middle Ages, was often code for "please don't look too closely at what is floating in the wine." So, yes, royal paranoia was entirely justified. Every royal meal resembled a very slow-burn mystery story. Every dish carried a quiet threat. Every spoonful arrived with the delicate tension of a cliffhanger. In medieval Europe, survival wasn't a matter of courage, divine favor, or physical strength. It often depended on whether you had a food taster who genuinely cared about you, or who, at the very least, had exceptional luck. The medieval world also had two great fears: anything that moved in the forest after dark, and anything that moved in the forest after dark while singing. This second fear leads us gently into one of the era's most enduring conspiracy theories. Whispers of hidden pagan groups deep in the woods, practicing old rituals under the soft glow of moonlight. Barefoot, probably. Unwashed, almost certainly. Villagers believed in these secret gatherings. The church believed in them. Even the local animals, in their skittish medieval way, seemed to acknowledge something odd happening among the trees. And unlike many medieval rumors, this one had truth buried inside it. But instead of robed sorcerers summoning terrible powers, the reality was far humbler. Picture a small group of exhausted peasants slipping quietly into the forest, seeking a moment's peace from the difficult rhythm of medieval life. They lit small fires, sang old songs passed down by grandparents, and burned herbs in the hope that their crops might survive another harsh season. Life was difficult. Hunger visited regularly. Weather destroyed fields without apology. If whispering to old spirits offered even a drop of comfort, they took it. These weren't sinister cults. They were quiet, informal gatherings, almost like early support groups, meeting in the woods with slightly more interesting incense. But the church saw things differently. Anything unapproved by Rome was quickly labeled dangerous, suspicious, or outright satanic. This fear gave rise to the forest cult hunters, priests who ventured into the woods with torches, holy water, and absolutely no understanding of the outdoors. Most of them tripped over tree roots, startled themselves with the sound of an owl, and hurried home declaring victory over imaginary demons. But occasionally they discovered something real, small stone circles still being used, bundles of herbs left in careful patterns, symbols carved into wood that predated Christianity itself, and a handful of peasants who absolutely did not want to explain what they were doing there at that hour. One of the most quietly fascinating of the medieval forest groups were the Benandanti of northern Italy, ordinary villagers who sincerely believed that on certain nights their spirits slipped out of their sleeping bodies to wander through the fields and battle witches in order to protect the crops. And the remarkable part is not that the stories existed, but that the Benandanti themselves spoke of them with peaceful confidence. When the church eventually interrogated them, hoping for dramatic confessions of dark magic, they instead found themselves listening to something closer to a gentle, earnest form of medieval superhero storytelling. It wasn't sinister. It wasn't rebellious. It was simply a group of people trying to make sense of the unseen world in the only way they knew how. And then there were the forest healers, women and sometimes men who worked quietly with herbs, poultices, moonlit rituals, and the softest murmured chants. These healers tended to the sick, soothed fevers, and mixed remedies from knowledge passed down through generations. Herbalism wasn't forbidden, at least not officially, unless someone happened to be exceptionally skilled at it. Then suddenly a helpful salve or a well-timed cure was redefined as a potential act of devilish involvement. But for most ordinary people, these healers were not frightening figures. They were simply the ones who knew what to do when a child coughed through the winter, or when a neighbor's joints ached from days of labor. So yes, in their own small and quiet way, the whispers were true. Medieval Europe did have hidden pagan traditions tucked away in its forests, nothing monstrous, nothing malicious. Just groups of people trying to hold on to old customs, old comforts, and old rhythms of life without letting the church's authority dampen their sense of connection to the land around them. They weren't plotting rebellions. They were simply protecting their own peaceful rituals. Now, if you grew up imagining medieval monks as gentle men who spent their days copying manuscripts, baking warm bread, and ringing bells at sunrise, the truth may come as a soft surprise. Some of them certainly fit that peaceful image, but others, quietly and discreetly, served as something very similar to intelligence agents wrapped in robes. While villagers prayed, nobles plotted, and kings stared nervously into their dinner bowls, monasteries were conducting a very different kind of holy mission, one of careful observation and whispered information gathering. In medieval terms, this was simply called keeping watch. Today, we might gently call it spying. The church, being the most powerful institution on the continent, needed eyes and ears in every corner of Europe. And monks were ideal for this role. They were literate, thoughtful, soft-spoken, and trained to observe human behavior with the precision of someone who spent all day contemplating moral failings. As they traveled between monasteries or visited towns for supplies, they quietly collected stories disguised as confessions, rumors hidden in casual conversation, and political secrets spoken a little too loudly in wooden taverns. They wrote all of it down in careful script, part historian, part analyst, part quietly patient observer. Among these watchful orders, the Dominicans stood out. Their mission was rooted in rooting out heresy, which required interviewing villagers, reading intercepted letters, and paying close attention to any unusual activity. To many people, they seemed to appear from nowhere the moment something even slightly suspicious occurred. A man sneezed near a fragile sacred text. A Dominican friar might materialize behind him, gently asking questions. Their presence was both reassuring and unnervingly thorough. Monastic travelers made excellent information carriers. They moved freely between cities without attracting suspicion. Letters given to them were rarely inspected, as nobody wanted to risk divine disapproval by questioning a monk. Kings quietly used them as informants, paying them to report on court gossip, troop movements, alliances forming in shadowy corners, or whether a group of nobles seemed to be preparing a suspiciously elaborate feast. It was, in its own way, the medieval version of a paid subscription service, except the subscription was monks, and when the Inquisition emerged, things grew even more structured. Suddenly there was a formal institution dedicated entirely to collecting and organizing information. Monks were tasked with interviewing suspected heretics, documenting local rumors, spreading questionnaires across villages, and forwarding the most important findings up the hierarchy. Some reports were grave and significant, revolts forming, hidden pagan rites, outlines of rebellion. Others read more like very slow, handwritten gossip columns. Brother Gregory reports the shoemaker's wife was seen carrying herbs at dusk. Possible witch. Continued observation recommended. Not every monk participated in these activities, of course, but enough did that villagers began to murmur that monasteries knew everything. And, in a quiet way, they weren't entirely wrong. A monk could stroll into a marketplace, buy a loaf of bread, ask a few polite questions, and within minutes understand more about the local marriages, feuds, and anxieties than many lifelong residents. So yes, the conspiracy was real, though not quite in the dramatic way later storytellers imagined. Beneath the chanting and candlelight, medieval monasteries operated a wide, calm, continent-spanning network of information and quiet surveillance. And unlike many medieval systems, this one worked surprisingly well. In the end, the most effective weapon of the Middle Ages wasn't the sword, the crossbow, or even the poisoned stew. It was a monk with a steady memory and a well-sharpened quill. If you asked an ordinary medieval European what the Knights Templar were up to, they might lower their voice and whisper something dramatic, guarding treasure, hoarding secrets, controlling kings, threatening the Pope, worshipping mysterious heads, summoning dark forces, ordinary nighttime hobbies, or so the stories went. Medieval people adored a dramatic conspiracy, and the Templars, with their enigmatic presence and surprising success, became the favorite targets of whispered imagination. And, as with many legends, the most interesting part is that some pieces were quietly true. The Templars began as a humble group of knights, sworn to protect pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Their mission was noble, simple, and deeply spiritual. But then something problematic happened. They became successful. Their influence grew so quickly and so wide that kings began adjusting their paranoia schedules simply to keep up with them. Within a century, the Templars owned castles, farmland, fleets of ships, and more wealth than many kingdoms combined. They had, quite unintentionally, become something like a medieval hybrid of elite soldiers, international bankers, and a mysterious club nobody felt fully comfortable questioning. Where power gathered, suspicion followed. Rumors spread that the Templars guarded a hidden treasure of vast size, and in this case, the rumor was not unfounded. The Templars created one of the earliest and most advanced banking systems in Europe. A pilgrim could deposit money in England and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem, a process astonishingly modern for a world where people still felt uneasy around mirrors and believed illnesses came from bad winds. They kept coded records, organized secure vaults, and moved wealth across great distances with an efficiency that made kings uneasy and tax collectors deeply frustrated. And then there were the rituals. Templars met in private, conducted ceremonies at night, and swore sacred oaths no outsider was permitted to witness. In the medieval imagination, secrecy never suggested something ordinary. It always hinted at the dramatic. So Europe, lacking information but rich in creativity, imagined they worshipped a strange severed head named Baphomet, which, translated loosely, meant, "We don't know what's happening, so let's imagine the most dramatic possibility." In truth, most of their secret rituals were extraordinarily mundane: confessions, disciplinary procedures, and organizational routines. Necessary, structured, and frankly quite boring. But medieval minds weren't satisfied by boring. They wanted mystery, tension, and hidden drama. And in the quiet absence of explanation, the Templars became the perfect canvas for every anxious imagination. King Philip IV of France, perpetually short on money and remarkably gifted at shifting blame, decided one day that the Knights Templar must be heretics. In medieval politics, heretic simply meant, "I would like your possessions, please." With this convenient interpretation in hand, he arrested the Templars, subjected them to harsh interrogations, and extracted confessions so exaggerated that even modern conspiracy theories would blush politely and step aside. Yet, as strange as it sounds, Philip was not entirely mistaken. The Templars did possess substantial treasure. They did operate a shadowy financial empire that stretched across continents. And they did guard knowledge from the public, not ominous demonic knowledge, but practical information about banking systems, coded communication, and disciplined military strategies. But in the medieval imagination, bookkeeping and demonic rituals lived surprisingly close together. Numbers looked suspicious, locks looked ominous. A ledger written in neat handwriting might as well have been a spell book. So yes, the Templars were victims of lies, exaggerations, and sensational accusations. But they were also undeniably guilty of becoming far too powerful for the comfort of kings. Their secrecy wasn't dark magic. It was simply efficient organization, which in the Middle Ages was practically indistinguishable from witchcraft. When the Black Death rolled into Europe in 1347, moving steadily through trade routes and leaving devastation in its wake, people understandably scrambled for explanations. What caused it? Why did it move so quickly? Why did it prefer crowded cities, unwashed hands, and households with questionable hygiene? Villagers blamed demons drifting on the wind, foul air rising from polluted swamps, or perhaps their neighbor's unsettling goat. But a more gripping theory spread quietly from town to town. The church knew more than it was telling, and unlike many medieval rumors, this theory was, gently, quietly, partly correct. The higher clergy had access to letters from merchants, physicians, sailors, and traveling monks. They received ship logs detailing sick crews, reports from port cities collapsing under the weight of the disease, and whispers from monasteries where entire communities were falling ill. While peasants were still in their fields, staring anxiously at a neighbor who had suddenly developed ominous boils, bishops were quietly packing their belongings and retreating to safer countryside residences with better air circulation. To be fair, the clergy were not scientists. Half believed disease came from unbalanced humors, and the other half from divine irritation. Yet they possessed one significant advantage over the general population: information. And in a world where news traveled slowly, slower than a weary peasant starting his week, this information created a noticeable gap. Bishops closed city gates days before outbreaks officially arrived. Monasteries barred their doors from the inside. Letters circulated among church officials, with coded warnings such as, "The ship brings dark tidings," which in calm medieval language meant, "Do not go outside. Everything is falling apart." Quarantine orders were especially suspicious. Some towns received warnings before a single person had shown symptoms, suggesting that someone, somewhere, had access to knowledge far beyond the average villager's reach. Merchants noticed it as well. Venetian traders wrote that church officials advised them to avoid certain ports nearly a week before outbreaks erupted there. Not prophecy, just a medieval version of insider information delivered quietly through the old channels. Meanwhile, the public received advice that was less helpful. People were told to confess more often, pray with renewed vigor, avoid foul-smelling air, burn herbs, or refrain from excessive joy. Yes, joy itself was considered a risk. Medieval Europe was unwavering in its commitment to discouraging happiness. So, did the church intentionally hide information? Not necessarily out of malice, but they did prioritize themselves, delayed warnings, and avoided admitting uncertainty. In the end, the villagers weren't wrong. Someone did understand more than they were sharing. The knowledge simply stayed within a very small circle. If your image of medieval monks is serene, men in robes humming hymns, tending little herb gardens, and copying manuscripts by candlelight, it may be time to shift that picture ever so gently. Because tucked between the pages of holy texts and beneath the calm chanting existed another category of monk entirely. These were the discreet specialists, the quiet problem solvers, men who could recite psalms from memory and also remove a political obstacle without interrupting the rhythm of choir practice. Yes, medieval Europe quietly employed cloistered assassins. And no, this is not the storyline of a sensational television series. It is, unfortunately for the monk's reputation, historically rooted. Many of these men were not drawn to monasteries for spiritual fulfillment. They joined because monasteries provided food, shelter, legal immunity, and the unique privilege of traveling across kingdoms without arousing suspicion. Monastic robes were essentially the medieval equivalent of a universal "do not question me" badge. And who recruited these quiet specialists? Nobles, naturally. The same nobles who already spent entire careers trying to poison one another's meals. If a noble wanted something done quietly, efficiently, and with plausible deniability, he did not hire a knight. Knights announced themselves loudly, wore clanking armor, and had an unfortunate tendency to survive long enough to brag. Instead, nobles hired brother. Please don't ask about my bag. A monk who traveled light, spoke little, and never explained why he kept leaving the monastery after dark. These specialist monks were often lay brothers, men who performed physical labor rather than scriptural study. They were strong, unnoticed, and able to travel on errands without suspicion. And when asked why they were on the road, they had an easy answer: "I am collecting alms." No one questioned it, no one wanted to. Except for the occasional dagger hidden beneath the folds of a robe, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. The records from the time never openly admit the existence of such individuals, but they hint at it repeatedly. A noble dying mysteriously, a rival tumbling from a window, a wealthy landowner miraculously donating all his possessions to the church before disappearing. These events appear too frequently to ignore. Letters between monasteries mention brothers who failed to observe discipline, which was monastic code for someone keeps sneaking out at night, and we're not sure why. Some monks were even caught with weapons, disguises, or forbidden documents. None ever confessed, of course. Monks had impeccable self-control, and the added advantage of implying that questioning them was equivalent to questioning God. Kingdoms tolerated this because monasteries solved problems quietly, efficiently, with minimal explanation required. So yes, villagers whispered that some monks were far more dangerous than their sermons suggested, and for once, their whispers carried an edge of truth. Beneath the soft candlelight and the gentle psalms, some monasteries sheltered men who could pray for your soul and ensure you met God much sooner than planned. When most people picture witch hunts, their minds drift to the well-known centuries of the 1500s and 1600s, times of bonfires, wide-brimmed hats, and anxious townsfolk who were convinced that the devil was probably living inside someone's goat. But long before these dramatic images ever became part of European memory, something softer, quieter, and far more secret was already happening. Medieval Europe didn't wait for the Renaissance to start worrying. It had already been living in a slow simmer of fear, suspicion, and whispered stories. And beneath those whispers, as strange as it sounds, there were small bits of truth folded into the panic. In many small villages, long before the grand trials and official manuals existed, people spoke in hushed voices about the wise women, the calm, capable women who wandered out to gather herbs under the moon. These weren't broom-flying sorceresses or storm-summoning spellcasters. They were simply the local healers, midwives, and unofficial listeners. The ones villagers sought out when they couldn't afford a doctor, which realistically was most of the time. After all, doctors in the Middle Ages often recommended treatments so questionable they could make a patient worse, simply by following instructions. These women, however, understood plants, birth, pain, and small secrets. They knew which herbs soothed fevers, which roots quieted fear, and which mixtures, when needed, could encourage a difficult husband to take a very long nap. Their knowledge was valuable, too valuable. In medieval Europe, simply knowing too much was enough to make people uneasy, and so, little by little, a quiet conspiracy formed that these women were part of a hidden network, sharing secrets beneath the moonlight. Herbs became symbols, knotted cords became signs, nighttime gatherings became suspicious. Yet strangely, this conspiracy wasn't entirely wrong. There really were small networks of healers who shared knowledge, trained one another, and passed down remedies that could have easily been misunderstood by the church. Their secrets weren't magic. They were simply science, observation, and generations of experience. But in a world driven by superstition, that alone was enough to look supernatural. Of course, fear spread faster than facts. When a cow died suddenly, the healer was blamed. When the harvest failed, the healer was blamed again. And when a husband fled the household to join a distant crusade, often because his wife had reminded him too many times to empty the chamber pot, well, that too could be the healer's fault. Eventually, this soft mistrust hardened into early witch hunts. They were unorganized, clumsy, and sadly very real, carried out not by official courts, but by frightened villagers who didn't understand what they were seeing. In a bittersweet twist, the only people truly practicing any kind of magic were the ones trying to keep everyone alive, a suspicious trait in the Middle Ages indeed. Medieval rulers had a flair for theatrics. They adored grand gestures, dramatic speeches, quiet betrayals, and occasionally the greatest performance of all, pretending to die, or at least letting the world believe they had. What makes the story even more intriguing is that medieval people themselves whispered about this possibility. In dim taverns, by candlelight, stories spread, and in at least one famous case, those whispers landed surprisingly close to the truth. The story centers around Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man so intelligent, so unusual, and so uncomfortably ahead of his time that Europe could never quite figure out what to make of him. He spoke several languages, wrote poetry, studied science, and kept a private zoo filled with animals few Europeans had ever seen. In a world where reading books could make people suspicious, Frederick's hobbies were more than enough to raise eyebrows. His death in 1250 was dramatic and thoroughly documented. The church relaxed. Nobles marked the moment. Europe mourned, or pretended to. But almost immediately, small rumors curled through the countryside. People began to wonder if Frederick had truly died at all. They imagined him hiding, waiting, preparing for a return more legendary than any knight's tale. Soon, entire small cults formed around the idea of the sleeping emperor, believing he would someday return to restore order. The stories grew stranger. Travelers claimed they saw him wandering through forests in disguise. Merchants insisted they met a nobleman who paid with Frederick's old coins. A fisherman swore a cloaked man with Frederick's unmistakable posture asked him for directions. It all sounded fantastical. But then history added another twist. Centuries later, a man named Richard of Eastwell appeared. A quiet, educated, mysterious figure who many believed was the secret son of Richard III. He spoke Latin, understood court behavior perfectly, and carried himself like someone who had never done anything so ordinary as wash his own linens. Historians still argue about his identity. And that's the unsettling part. Medieval kings did sometimes vanish, disguise themselves, or remove their names from public life to survive political chaos. Record-keeping was unreliable, more of a someone wrote it down before spilling wine on the page type of system. So while the rumors were shaky, they were not entirely foolish. In a world driven by rebellion, plague, crusades, and the constant risk of poisoned supper, the idea of a king quietly stepping away from the throne doesn't sound unreasonable at all. Few things frightened medieval Europeans more than water, not demons, not taxes, and not even plague. Water, especially water drawn from wells, felt unpredictable. It could nourish a field, drown a child, or spread illness, long before anyone understood why. So whenever people began dying mysteriously, villagers followed an instinct older than written history: blame the nearest well. Soon the idea of poisoned wells seeped through the countryside. If someone fell sick, the well was cursed. If livestock died, the well was tainted. If someone tripped over a chicken or burnt their bread, the well had surely been bewitched. Medieval Europeans had a wonderfully flexible sense of cause and effect. But once again, hidden beneath the panic, there was a thin but unmistakable layer of truth. Wells were sometimes poisoned, not by witches or demons, but by rival towns, invading armies, or furious neighbors whose grudges had fermented a bit too long. During sieges, poisoning a town's water supply was a common tactic. Soldiers would toss dead animals, toxic plants, or anything unpleasant into the wells. Siege manuals even recommended it, as casually as if suggesting a recipe. And so, the villagers' fear, though often misdirected, was not entirely without basis. In the Middle Ages, even the simplest conspiracy could contain a fragment of reality, enough to keep people whispering for generations. In medieval Europe, the night was not simply darkness. It was a curtain the world pulled gently over itself each evening, soft and heavy, filled with sounds that felt both familiar and unsettling. Villagers closed their shutters, barred their doors, and whispered prayers, believing that anything could be wandering outside. And in that quiet fear, an entire category of shadowy figures lived unnoticed: the wanderers, the stragglers, and the strangely purposeful travelers who walked from town to town, carrying nothing but a small satchel and a story they refused to explain. Many believed these travelers were thieves or spies. Others claimed they were holy men on private missions. But beneath the guessing, there was a softer explanation. Some of these wanderers were simply men who belonged nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Pilgrims, messengers, scribes, and the occasional monk avoiding responsibilities back home. Medieval Europe was full of people slipping through the cracks, not because they were dangerous, but because the world moved slowly, and names were easy to forget. Travel was exhausting, unpredictable, and often lonely. Inns were rare, roads were muddy, and most journeys involved hours of walking under a sky that did not change quickly. And so, when a quiet traveler entered a village, villagers filled in the silence with their own guesses. Over time, those guesses grew into little conspiracies, whispers about men carrying secrets from faraway kingdoms, or messages too sensitive to write down. And, in a gentle way, this was partly true. Some travelers genuinely carried news long before any official announcement would reach a town. Others brought stories of storms, famines, or distant conflicts. Villagers remembered these coincidences and stitched them together in their own way. Thus, the medieval wanderer became both a harmless passerby and an unsettling symbol of the unknown. In a world lit by candles and ruled by imagination, the quietest people often inspired the loudest rumors. Prophecies in the Middle Ages were not always dramatic announcements carved into stone or shouted by wild-eyed mystics. More often, they were gentle predictions murmured in small rooms, passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, or written in the margins of old manuscripts by monks who had too much time and too little entertainment. Many of these prophecies were vague, broad, and astonishingly unhelpful. They warned of great troubles or dark times, or a year in which things will change, which describes almost every year in human history. Yet medieval people took these predictions seriously, not because they believed every word, but because life was unpredictable. A bad harvest, a sudden illness, or a distant war could arrive without warning. Prophecies were simply a way of trying to prepare the heart for uncertainty. They were comforting in their own quiet way. Some prophecies, however, gained strange popularity. A monk might predict that a river would flood, and when it eventually did, as rivers always do, people believed he had special insight. Another might claim that a distant king would fall, and when the king inevitably passed away, the prophecy gained reputation. And so, slowly and gently, prophecies gathered weight, not because they were supernatural, but because they were easy to remember and comforting to repeat. In truth, medieval prophecies were less about magic and more about pattern recognition. Monks collected weather notes, merchants tracked trade routes, and villagers watched the seasons carefully. When something felt unusual, someone would quietly turn it into a prediction. Over time, these predictions were rewritten, exaggerated, or polished, until they sounded almost mystical. In the end, prophecy in the Middle Ages was never about seeing the future. It was about giving shape to fear and hope, in a world where both followed people as closely as their own shadows. Rumors in medieval Europe were not sharp or sensational, the way modern rumors spread across screens and conversations. They were slow-moving things, drifting from one village to the next like autumn leaves carried by a soft wind. Sometimes they were harmless, stories about a distant noble who had adopted too many cats, or a monk who fell asleep during prayer and snored loudly enough to shake the rafters. Other times they were heavier, filled with worry or suspicion, and they changed the mood of whole communities. What made medieval rumors powerful was their patience. A story could wander through villages for months before reaching its final form, changing slightly each time someone repeated it. One person added a detail, another removed one. By the time the rumor settled, it had become something new, something shaped by hundreds of quiet voices, and without official newspapers or trustworthy messengers, rumors often served as the only source of information for entire regions. Sometimes rumors were surprisingly accurate. A merchant might predict rising grain prices, and villagers would prepare accordingly. Other times they were entirely wrong, but spread because people needed a story to explain the world around them. When lightning struck a barn, someone blamed a traveler. When the weather changed suddenly, someone blamed a saint. Over time, these small misunderstandings wove themselves into everyday conversations. And so, rumors became a soft but influential force in medieval life. They guided decisions, shaped beliefs, and even changed how people treated one another. They were rarely malicious, just reflections of a world where uncertainty was constant, and stories where the only light people could carry into the dark. Across medieval Europe, countless small villages existed quietly for generations, before slowly fading from memory. They were not destroyed by war or abandonment. They simply shrank over time, like a candle burning low. A few families moved away, some passed on. A road shifted, a stream dried, and little by little, the village grew quieter, until only the wind remembered the paths that once led home. These forgotten villages became sources of quiet wonder. Travelers reported glimpses of crumbled walls hidden behind trees, or faint shapes of old foundations beneath wild grass. Sometimes they found broken pots, rusted tools, or stones arranged in ways that suggested long-lost gardens or workshops. But there was never enough to tell a complete story. Villagers nearby made guesses, gentle ones. Some believed the village suffered a sickness. Others thought the land grew poor. Some imagined the people simply packed their belongings one morning and walked away for reasons no one would ever know. In a time without records, the simplest explanation was often the one chosen. And yet, these quiet ruins held a special place in the medieval imagination. They were reminders that life moved slowly, but never stopped. That villages grew, faded, and eventually blended back into the earth. And that the land itself carried more stories than any person ever could. Imagine someone in the Middle Ages opening a military guide, only to see a calm instruction tucked between the usual tactics. Step 3. Sabotage their plumbing. It sounds absurd, almost humorous, yet it was a strategy medieval army actually used. But ordinary villagers, far from castle walls and armies, had no idea that poisoning wells was a battlefield trick. So, when people began falling sick miles from any conflict, the countryside filled the silence with its own explanations. Outsiders became the easiest suspects. A traveler passing through was instantly suspicious. A merchant selling herbs, clearly hiding a vial of poison. A scholar who looked like he could read more than one language, absolutely guilty. Reading was basically witchcraft. The fear grew so quickly, and spread so quietly, that entire communities found themselves blaming anyone who didn't fit neatly into their everyday rhythm. One of the darkest results of this fear emerged during the Black Death, when desperate, terrified towns accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells. The accusations were false, cruel, and fueled by panic. But they showed just how deeply the well poisoner conspiracy had taken root in medieval minds. Water was mysterious, unpredictable, and terrifyingly essential. It was the perfect target for the imagination. Yet even without any villains, wells could, and often did, become toxic on their own. Rain washed animal waste into the water. Dead rats fell in. Leaves, mud, and mold slowly brewed into a cloudy, dangerous mixture no one understood. Wells were simply unfiltered holes in the ground, serving towns where people bathed once a year and believed that sickness was caused by a misbehaving star. So, in a quiet and ironic twist, some wells truly were poisoned, not by witches, not by spy networks, not by passing travelers, but by bacteria, something medieval people would have considered sorcery. In the end, villagers frightened each other with stories of secret poisoners, while nature quietly did the poisoning for free. And when everything felt unstable, when the world made no sense, the simplest explanation became the most comforting one. In medieval Europe, the simplest explanation was always the same: the well must have done it. Medieval Europe adored drama. If a stranger wandered into town claiming to be a long-lost prince, nobody bothered to question it. They immediately threw a feast, started heated debates about lineage, and sharpened pitchforks just in case the situation took a political turn. This wasn't only because medieval people were gullible, though they certainly enjoyed a good story. It was because royal impostors were surprisingly common. without photography, fingerprints, or any reliable form of identification. Confirming someone's identity was essentially a group opinion. The medieval version of a background check was simply, does he look royal? And looking royal usually meant having most of your teeth and not smelling strongly of onions. One of the strangest and most whispered examples was Richard of Eastwell. He appeared in Kent in the 1400s, quiet, humble, and suspiciously educated. He claimed in gentle hints and unfinished sentences to be the secret son of Richard III. A bold claim, yet he spoke Latin, wrote beautifully, and carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had never plowed a field in his life. He never fully admitted anything, but he never denied it either. Medieval England, always hungry for intrigue, believed him. And the unsettling part is that centuries later, historians still debate the truth. Medieval records were scribbled inconsistently, often on paper so thin it dissolved in the rain. The possibility remains open. But Richard wasn't the only one. Medieval Europe was full of resurrected royals and mysterious strangers who claimed familiar names. Some women later claimed to be Anastasia of Poland, complete with court manners and memories that no ordinary villagers should have. Entire regions went to battle over whether someone was or wasn't a princess, shouting confidently across fields, even though none of them had seen the real princess in their lives. And sometimes, the impostor wasn't an impostor at all. Kings occasionally fled danger, escaped assassination attempts, or hid in plain clothes when times grew unstable. A traveling merchant or quiet pilgrim might indeed have been a royal in disguise, passing through unnoticed. Medieval politics loved a dramatic twist. A royal death always seemed suspicious. People whispered that bodies were faked, deaths were staged, or rulers had slipped away to live in peace under assumed names. In a world built on uncertainty, these stories felt comforting. So yes, royal impostors were a conspiracy theory. But they came true so often that medieval Europe eventually stopped asking, "Is this possible?" and instead asked, "All right, which cousin is pretending to be dead this time?" If you've ever wondered what the medieval version of a restricted library looked like, imagine a small, windowless chamber deep inside a monastery. The air is still. The room is locked with heavy iron bolts, and the only person allowed to enter is a tired monk who looks like he hasn't slept since the Third Crusade. Inside, shelves are filled with manuscripts the church decided were too dangerous, too misleading, or simply too inconvenient for ordinary people to read. Villagers whispered about these rooms as if they contained cursed objects, but the reality was much calmer, much quieter, and somehow even stranger. The church controlled nearly all education in medieval Europe. If you wanted to read, write, or perform basic arithmetic, you had to rely on them. Naturally, this meant they also controlled what not to read. Anything that contradicted scripture, challenged their authority, or implied something scandalous, such as the earth moving around the sun, was quietly removed. But burning these books was messy and suspicious. Flames attracted attention. Curious peasants gathered when smoke rose. So instead, the church stored forbidden texts in secured archives, with names like armoria, scriptory vaults, or in some cases, simply the locked room that Brother Thomas guards for reasons unknown. And Brother Thomas, by the way, always looked slightly guilty whenever he left. The contents were surprisingly eclectic. Some texts were banned for political reasons, some for scientific ideas centuries ahead of their time. Others simply disagreed with someone's interpretation of theology. But together, they formed a secret collection of knowledge that medieval Europe held at arm's length. Too dangerous to burn, too valuable to share, and too mysterious not to fear. These rooms became the quiet heart of countless conspiracies. Villagers imagined demons bound inside books, spells written in forbidden ink, or secrets capable of shaking kingdoms. And although none of that was true, the truth was still unsettling in its own tranquil way. behind monastery walls, in rooms no one spoke about, medieval Europe hid knowledge, not magical, not supernatural, but simply knowledge people weren't ready for. In the quiet corners of medieval monasteries, tucked far behind stone corridors and candle-lit halls, there existed a kind of room that seemed designed specifically to encourage whispers. These were small, usually windowless chambers, dusty, cool, and sealed with heavy bolts that creaked softly whenever someone dared to open them. A tired-looking monk, often a man who appeared as though he had survived 3 lifetimes of late-night copying sessions, would stand guard outside. His eyes carried the sort of permanent exhaustion that suggested he had memorized far too many psalms and slept far too little. Inside these locked spaces rested shelves of books the church preferred no one to read, volumes that villagers spoke about in hushed tones as if they were enchanted relics. And the truth was far stranger and far calmer than rumor ever suggested. These hidden book vaults were very real, because the medieval church didn't just control spiritual life, it controlled learning itself. Reading, writing, studying, questioning. All pathways led directly through their approval. Naturally, this meant they also controlled which ideas needed to be quietly tucked away. What they stored was an assortment of knowledge that, to modern eyes, seems almost gentle in its danger. Fragile manuscripts containing alternative gospels, texts expressing theological opinions that could invite questions faster than an inquisitor could sharpen a quill. Carefully copied translations of Arabic scientific works, which were often wonderfully accurate, but inconveniently ahead of the church's doctrinal comfort zone. Medical treatises describing human anatomy with such clarity that bishops reportedly paled at the sight of them. And then there were the ancient pagan writings, scrolls and codices preserved not for belief but for curiosity, copied by monks who always insisted, "It is strictly for research," which was the medieval version of "please don't yell at me." What makes these rooms even more fascinating is how much debate they caused. Church officials argued endlessly about their purpose. Some believed these works needed to be preserved, stored safely for a future generation who might understand them better. Others believed that allowing them to exist at all was risky, that such knowledge inspired too many uncomfortable thoughts. Thoughts like, if this pagan astronomer correctly predicted a solar eclipse, what other truths might he have been right about? At times the answer was a long silence followed by the polite clearing of a bishop's throat, as if he were trying to cough the question out of existence. And despite the temptation, they didn't simply burn the manuscripts. Burning created smoke, attention, and awkward conversations. 3 things the medieval church found extremely inconvenient. Instead, the texts were quietly collected, catalogued, studied, and locked away. When inquisitors confiscated the libraries of accused heretics, they rarely destroyed them. They sorted them, filed them, preserved the most interesting pieces like butterflies pinned in a display case, because even forbidden ideas had value. Knowledge, even unsettling knowledge, was a form of power. And the people of medieval Europe sensed this. They felt, deep in their bones, that somewhere behind heavy monastery doors lay books that could reshape the world, that hidden among the incense and chanting and dim candlelight were answers that stretched beyond the limits of what the village priest preached each Sunday. This awareness gave birth to endless rumors, soft conversations, and late-night speculation. The truth was simple. The vaults existed. The books existed. The caution was real. And, like all precious things in the Middle Ages, the safest way to protect them was to pretend they weren't there at all. If there was any place where conspiracy wasn't a theory but an accepted lifestyle, it was medieval Italy. The cities we now admire for their beauty, Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa, Siena, were, in their day, quietly brimming with tension. They were magnificent, yes, but behind those marble facades and graceful bridges lay a sprawling network of rivalries so delicate and persistent that they shaped almost every aspect of Italian life. While the streets bustled peacefully on the surface, beneath them simmered a constant hum of espionage, political maneuvering, and a subtle competition that never truly relaxed. These independent city-states competed in everything they touched: trade routes, banking systems, cathedral designs. Even fashion became battlegrounds for prestige. If one city prospered, its neighbors grew suspicious. If one leader formed an alliance, another city whispered about betrayal. A tower built too tall could spark an argument that lasted longer than some dynasties. And so, quietly, they developed a culture of discreet warfare. No marching armies, no triumphant banners. Just an endless stream of spies, coded letters, secrets passed in the market, and political accidents that seemed to happen at oddly convenient times. Venice, in particular, became legendary for its sophistication. The Venetian government built an entire intelligence council, complete with encrypted correspondence, secret financial monitoring, shadow agents scattered throughout Europe, and those infamous Poches de Leon, the stone drop boxes where citizens could anonymously report suspicious behavior. Inside small government rooms, silent councils sifted through these messages, deciding which whisper deserved investigation and which rumor needed to quietly disappear. Even Venetians feared their own government's ability to know more than anyone expected. Florence, guided by the wealthy and quietly influential Medici family, specialized in a very different art: financial persuasion, subtle bribery, and the gentle nudging of political outcomes through banking pressure. Milan, with its stern rulers, used intimidation. Genoa excelled in subtle naval sabotage. Siena practiced the art of pretending to be uninvolved while absolutely being involved. Together, they created a soft, ongoing war, silent, invisible, but deeply felt. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't exaggeration. The conspiracies were real because the rivalries were real. Italy was in many ways the birthplace of elegant political subtlety. They didn't just fight wars, they mastered the art of fighting them quietly. And they did it all with a kind of refined, unhurried confidence that only Italy could pull off, mixing danger with style, secrecy with ceremony, and rivalry with a kind of strange, enduring beauty. Long before modern novels filled bookstores with stories of holy bloodlines and secret descendants, medieval Europe was already completely engrossed in the idea. To the people of the Middle Ages, nothing was more irresistible than the thought of a hidden heir, a lost royal, or a noble family quietly protecting a lineage no one was supposed to know about. It was a conspiracy that seeped through villages, echoed in royal courts, and appeared in chronicles where the writers often seemed a little too excited to be documenting history. In this world, your family tree was as valuable as any weapon or fortress. Being connected, even distantly, to a respected ancestor could determine your future. And so noble families became experts at adjusting their genealogies, smoothing out the embarrassing details while highlighting the impressive ones. Soon, half the aristocracy claimed descent from Charlemagne, a feat that would have required him to father enough children to populate a small nation. Others chose Trojan heroes, Roman emperors, or biblical kings. Medieval genealogists were less historians and more enthusiastic storytellers, but beneath the exaggerations, there were real secrets. Letters discovered centuries later describe illegitimate royal children quietly placed in monasteries or hidden in the countryside, raised without knowing their true origins. These children existed outside official lineage charts, yet their blood carried political consequences that echoed long after they grew up. Some of these hidden heirs resurfaced quietly, emerging into public life like soft ripples on still water. Others disappeared entirely, leaving only faint traces, half-remembered rumors, unclaimed coats of arms, or a suspicious talent for reading Latin in families that supposedly came from humble farms. And then there were the rare descendants, centuries later, who uncovered old letters or forgotten legal notes, and realized that great-great-grandmother, the woman everyone believed to be an ordinary peasant, was in fact the unacknowledged daughter of a wandering duke who had more charm than responsibility. The Middle Ages never failed to tuck drama into the most unexpected corners. One of the most whispered examples involves the Capetian dynasty of France. For generations, this royal line quietly supported certain noble families with mysterious sums of money, payments that made much more sense once historians noticed those same families were linked to stories of vanished royal infants. The connections were never stated outright, but the pattern was too gentle, too consistent to ignore. Meanwhile, in England, chroniclers scribbled down accounts of hidden heirs living under assumed names during times of civil war. Kings and princes disguised as shepherds, scribes, or household servants, waiting patiently for the moment they might reclaim the throne. A moment that, as history shows, usually never arrived. The waiting stretched on, silent and uneventful, until the secret simply faded into everyday life. Even the church left clues. Monks occasionally added tired little notes in the margins of their records, another noble child entrusted to us. Origin, unknown, which was the diplomatic monastic way of saying, someone delivered a baby at the door again, and still, no one will admit whose it is. These infants grew up quietly behind monastery walls, their identities wrapped in layers of secrecy meant to protect families, reputations, and sometimes entire kingdoms. So, was there a conspiracy surrounding holy bloodlines? Absolutely, but not in the mystical way later storytellers imagined. These lineages were not hidden because they were sacred, but because they were complicated. Scandalous affairs, political bargaining chips, insurance against unstable thrones. Medieval Europe didn't need divine heirs to create drama. Its nobles were perfectly capable of producing enough secrets on their own to keep the continent buzzing with rumors until the end of time. When medieval Christians spoke in hushed tones about secret Jewish and Muslim networks working behind the scenes of European society, they conjured images worthy of a grand forbidden saga. They imagined coded messages passed in candlelight, rebels plotting in shadowy basements, and coordinated plans stretching across kingdoms like the threads of an invisible web. These whispers spread fear, worry, and the kind of restless curiosity that fills a village when the night is particularly dark. But here is the twist, the part no medieval imagination was prepared for. These networks truly existed, yet their purpose was gentle, practical, and tragically misunderstood. They weren't designed for domination or rebellion. They were designed entirely for survival. Jewish and Muslim communities in medieval Europe lived under continual pressure. They were overtaxed, expelled, restricted, accused of impossible crimes, and blamed for unfortunate events ranging from bad harvests to astronomical alignments. Whenever fear surged, accusations followed. And so, to protect themselves and each other, these communities quietly built lifelines, safe houses, discreet travel routes, sympathetic traders, and healers who moved in disguise to tend to those in need. Entire families traveled these hidden paths, moving by coded signals such as a lamp left in a window, a particular line scratched near a doorway, or a polite phrase about the pomegranate harvest that meant, "We need help, we need to leave." Jewish families maintained routes stretching through France, the Rhineland, and the Iberian Peninsula, each stop watched over by someone whose greatest skill was appearing entirely ordinary. Muslim communities used similar paths across Spain and the Mediterranean, carrying not only people, but knowledge, language, and tradition. To medieval eyes, accustomed to systems that moved slowly, like carts trudging through mud, these underground routes worked with astonishing efficiency. And because they worked so well, Christians often mistook competence for conspiracy. If a persecuted group managed to survive, that alone seemed suspicious. Their reasoning was simple and deeply medieval. If they escaped danger, then danger must be increased. Yet behind the noise, these quiet networks saved lives. They preserved wisdom, they protected culture and family ties during centuries when both were threatened daily. Some historians even believe these early systems of cooperation later inspired more organized resistance movements during the Renaissance. Ironically, the only conspiracy theorists who understood that a network existed were the very people who wished to harm it, and even they completely misunderstood its purpose. It wasn't a scheme for overthrowing kingdoms. It wasn't an underground army. It was simply a fragile lifeline woven by people who wanted to survive another year, another season, another uncertain dawn. So yes, the conspiracy was real, but its heart was compassion, not control. A rare and gentle exception in an age not particularly known for kindness. Medieval Europe officially functioned on feudalism. Kings at the top, nobles below them, peasants at the bottom, and taxes filtering downward like an endless, confusing waterfall. It was the system everyone recognized, the structure written in laws and preached in churches. But beneath this noisy and tangled surface rested another system, quiet, subtle, and entirely unofficial. The shadow economy. Medieval people rarely spoke of it formally, yet they used it constantly. It was in many ways the real foundation on which daily life rested. This hidden world was made of favors exchanged behind barns, quiet agreements in taverns, and whispered deals struck after dark. Thieves, smugglers, lenders, and remarkably resourceful peasants created networks that connected towns, cities, and even distant kingdoms. Goods passed through these channels the way water travels through underground streams, unseen, essential, and always moving. Medieval people told stories about these networks, warned children about them, and debated their morality, all while participating in them with unwavering enthusiasm. Thieves' guilds existed, organized and surprisingly methodical, even if they didn't wear the dramatic outfits stories later invented for them. They settled disputes, assigned territories, and punished independent thieves who disrupted their quiet order. In an age where official law enforcement struggled to manage basic peacekeeping, thieves ended up forming something that almost resembled a professional code of conduct. Then there were the informal moneylenders, operating in dimly lit corners of taverns, private rooms in monasteries, or the homes of people who outwardly claimed extreme piety. Charging interest was technically a sin, yet somehow exceptions were always made when the loan benefited a friend, a cousin, or a neighbor who asked very politely. Smuggling was nearly universal. If an item could be taxed, someone was smuggling it. Salt, wool, ink, wine. Nothing escaped the possibility of being spirited away through back alleys and hidden carts. Marketplaces had their own quiet conspiracies. Bakers stretched flour with cheaper grains. Butchers adjusted scales when no one was looking. Fishmongers proudly insisted their catch was fresh, even when the fish looked like it had witnessed multiple crusades. Yet every Sunday, these same traders folded their hands and bowed their heads at church, offering the calm expressions of people who definitely did not cheat 3 customers that morning. And so, the medieval shadow economy thrived, efficient, familiar, and often far more reliable than the official systems. The greatest conspiracy wasn't that it existed. It was that everyone pretended not to be involved, even as they relied on it every day. The actors moved silently, stretching their limbs, adjusting flowing sleeves, and whispering lines under their breath, as if the words themselves were fragile wings. Each gesture, each practiced step, was a promise of the story to come, a delicate invitation to leave the world outside and step into a dream woven from silk and shadow. The audience, seated on low benches or soft cushions, leaned forward slightly, their faces illuminated by lantern light that flickered like fireflies caught in amber. Even the air seemed to shimmer, scented faintly with incense, and the distant perfume of blooming night flowers carried on a warm breeze. As the performance began, the quiet thrumming of a drum became a heartbeat for the entire room. Fingers plucked at zithers, sliding along strings that hummed in harmony with whispered lines of poetry. Masks shifted subtly with the actors' movements, the painted expressions revealing a story that was part sorrow, part joy, part longing, all interwoven in the soft tension between gesture and sound. Here even silence had weight. Pauses were measured, deliberate, a conversation between performer and audience that needed no words. Outside the theaters, the floating world continued to stir. Lanterns reflected on the smooth cobblestones, creating paths of golden light that wound between small shops, tea houses, and courtyards hidden behind carved wooden gates. Perfumes of roasted barley, spiced wine, and candle smoke drifted lazily, curling into alleyways where poets scribbled lines under the dim glow of lamps. Lovers walked slowly, hands barely touching, smiles barely whispered, as though even emotion required refinement in Kaifeng. Street musicians practiced quietly in corners, their melodies weaving around the softer rhythms of the city, blending seamlessly with the laughter and muted chatter spilling from tea-house screens. Even the smallest moments carried the care of art. A servant arranging cups on a tray did so like a choreographed dance, a brushstroke in the larger picture of the evening. A child chasing a lantern along a curved street became a living spark of motion in a city that never truly slept. And through it all, the weight of time seemed to soften. Days of labor, hours of worry, the sharp edges of duty, all melted into the steady, calm pulse of the night. Kaifeng's floating world was a realm of contrast, yet everything was balanced. Pleasure without vulgarity, performance without chaos, life without harsh interruption. Each lantern, each note of music, each carefully measured gesture contributed to a harmony that felt almost magical, though the magic was quiet, gentle, and entirely human. Here, one could watch the world transform simply by observing. A simple cup of tea could become a ritual, a whispered poem could feel like revelation, and a passing glance could hold the weight of entire stories. As the night deepened further, the faint sound of water from nearby canals added a soft, rippling undercurrent to the music and laughter. Bridges arched gracefully, lanterns dangling like jewels from their railings, and gondolas glided slowly beneath, oars moving with quiet precision. The reflection of city lights danced on the water's surface, doubling the glow, making it impossible to tell where the lanterns ended and the stars began. Even those who had never sought art, pleasure, or escape found themselves softened by the rhythm of Kaifeng. Scholars closed their eyes briefly between verses. Officials sipped tea with newfound calm, and wandering monks paused to appreciate the simple perfection of a silk curtain swaying in the night breeze. The floating world was not a place one hurried through. It was a place that invited lingering, that demanded attention to the small, the delicate, and the fleeting. And in this quiet, rhythmic attentiveness, the city revealed its true gift. A night that could soothe even the most restless mind. A world where the heart slowed, and imagination wandered freely, untroubled by time or expectation. By the final hours, as the lanterns dimmed and performers lowered their masks, the streets exhaled a soft collective sigh. The music faded into the whispers of the wind, the laughter melted into shadows, and the city, still alive but at peace, waited patiently for the first soft touch of dawn. Kaifeng, like a great slumbering organism, held its secrets close, ready to awaken again when night fell, and the world wished for beauty, calm, and quiet wonder once more. Inside one of the quieter tea houses, a small group had gathered in a shadowed corner, their voices no louder than the gentle rustle of silk. A young courtesan, her robe a soft gradient of jade and pearl, moved gracefully between them, carrying a tray of steaming tea. Each cup released a whisper of chrysanthemum and osmanthus into the air, mingling with the faint scent of ink and paper left behind by the poets. She poured carefully, her movements deliberate, like a silent conversation with the tea itself. One of the visitors, A scholar who had spent the afternoon hunched over scrolls watched her with quiet fascination, the way her hands hovered above the cups, the tilt of her head as she listened to a whispered verse, the faint smile that curved her lips. All of it was an art, a living performance more subtle than any theater. She didn't speak much, yet every gesture conveyed warmth, attentiveness, and understanding. It was easy to forget the world outside the paper-thin walls of the tea house. Nearby, another performer prepared her zither, fingers brushing lightly over the strings. Each note seemed to shimmer in the lantern light, delicate and precise, vibrating just long enough to leave a trace on the listener's heart before fading into the next. She closed her eyes as she played, her body swaying ever so slightly, each movement echoing the rhythm of the music. A hush fell over the patrons, as though even the room itself leaned in to listen. The sound didn't demand attention. It invited it, coaxing the mind to slow, to linger, to drift. In another corner, a courtesan practiced calligraphy, the brush gliding over silk with the kind of ease that comes from years of dedication. Each character was a miniature poem, each stroke deliberate, balanced, and alive. She occasionally glanced up, meeting a patron's eyes briefly, a silent acknowledgement, a subtle connection, then returned to her work. In Qifeng, even the act of writing became performance, every motion a dance between concentration and elegance. The tea houses were not just spaces for observing beauty, they were places of gentle instruction. Patrons learned by watching how to pour tea without spilling, how to balance a note in music, how to move with grace even when carrying a heavy tray. Even a simple laugh or sigh was calibrated, harmonizing with the room rather than breaking it. It was a delicate art, and everyone, even unconsciously, participated. Outside, the lantern-lit streets pulsed softly with life. A masked acrobat leapt from balcony to balcony, her feet whispering against the wooden beams, drawing gasps of delight that softened into quiet appreciation. Children chased shadows along the walls, their laughter curling around the notes of a zither played in the distance. Merchants with quiet carts paused, enchanted by the rhythm of the evening, forgetting for a moment the weight of trade, taxes, and unsorted goods. As the night deepened, the tea houses shifted. Conversations became softer, music slower, gestures more languid. Patrons who had entered seeking novelty now sought calm. Courtesans moved with gentler grace, their eyes attentive but patient, their smiles quiet invitations rather than declarations. Every sip of tea, every note plucked, every brushstroke of ink was measured, intentional, a meditation in motion. Somewhere in the heart of the floating world, a pair of lovers leaned across a small table, their hands brushing lightly over cups of warm tea. They spoke in hushed tones, their words carried softly by the music, invisible to all but each other. A courtesan approached to refill their tea, her presence barely noticed, and yet the subtle shift of attention made the air between them feel heavier with quiet intimacy. In Kaifeng, small moments mattered as much as grand spectacles. Even the performers, often imagined by outsiders as separate from the world, were part of its rhythm. They observed, they listened, they guided, not only the audience but each other. A zither player might glance toward the calligrapher, adjusting tempo to the sweep of a brushstroke. A poet paused mid-verse, inspired by a flicker of lantern light dancing across a silk screen. The floating world was a network of tiny interactions, a web of delicate cause and effect that only those attuned could perceive. And so, the night in Qifeng lingered. Lanterns reflected in polished wooden floors. The faint scent of flowers wove through the air, and the gentle hum of human presence created a kind of music all its own. Patrons, performers, and courtesans alike moved through the evening as if suspended in a slow, endless dance. The city breathed softly around them, protecting their secrets, holding their joy, and offering a space where time itself seemed willing to pause. In this floating world, every gesture mattered, every sound had weight, and every glance carried poetry. Here, The mundane became magical, the fleeting eternal, and the heart, however burdened in daylight, could rest in the slow rhythm of night. As midnight stretched toward the early hours, the main streets of Kifeng's pleasure quarter began to empty. Lanterns still glowed, but their light fell on smoother, quieter cobblestones. The laughter softened, the music became a whisper, and the city seemed to exhale, settling into its hidden rhythms. For those who knew where to look, the district revealed another layer entirely, a network of alleyways, back doors, and concealed courtyards where the most private artistry thrived. Here, beyond the gaze of ordinary patrons, the secret guilds of performers and artisans practiced their craft. A calligrapher traced delicate ink lines onto silk scrolls in a courtyard, lit only by a single hanging lantern, her brush moving like water flowing over stone. Nearby, a musician plucked a guqin softly, each note vibrating with a resonance so subtle it seemed to hum through the stones themselves. These guilds were not merely professional collectives, they were families, protectors of skills passed down through generations. Apprentices learned to move without sound, to observe without being noticed, to perfect gestures so subtle they could convey entire emotions in a flick of a wrist. Courtesans moved along these hidden corridors with equal grace. Some carried messages, delicately folded notes, or folded silk with instructions for patrons or performers. Others trained quietly, practicing the art of refined presence, how to tilt one's head, how to pour tea, how to make the faintest smile convey warmth without intrusion. Every movement mattered, and every gesture was a story. The streets themselves seemed to bend around them, granting passage as if honoring their skill. In one secluded alley, a pair of courtesans exchanged a whispered conversation, their words soft as the brush of petals falling from a plum tree. "Did the patron request the poem?" one asked, her voice barely audible over the rustle of silk. The other nodded, glancing at the lanterns above, their flickering light casting dancing shadows across the walls. "He will be here soon, just past the jade gate. Prepare the tea and the music. Let him enter as though the night itself has welcomed him." Such was the rhythm of Kifeng, a choreography of gestures, sounds, and scents, where anticipation carried the weight of art. Even the city's edges held secrets. Narrow bridges arched over hidden canals, lined with soft lanterns reflecting in the water below. A lone figure glided in a small boat, a lute in hand, playing melodies that only the quietest ears could hear. The sound mingled with the soft lapping of water against wood, creating a private symphony that belonged entirely to the night. A cat prowled silently along the canal's edge, pausing only to watch the lantern light ripple across the surface. In these moments, time seemed to fold, layering sound, light, and movement into a dreamlike pattern. Kifeng's floating world was not only a place of performance, but also of quiet intrigue. Courtesans and performers were keen observers, collecting stories like precious scrolls. They noted the briefest hesitations in conversation, the subtle exchange of glances, and the fleeting gestures of hands. Such details were never wasted. They became inspiration for poetry, music, and art, or occasionally for gentle guidance, a quiet suggestion that might shift the course of a patron's decisions. In this way, the floating world extended its influence without ever raising its voice, shaping the city as softly as a painter's brush on silk. As dawn approached, the tea houses exhaled the last of their warmth. Patrons left in silence, their footsteps absorbed by the smooth cobblestones. Courtesans and performers retreated to hidden rooms, where incense smoldered and water basins reflected pale light from the slowly brightening sky. Lanterns were lowered, screens folded, instruments cleaned and stored. Even the city itself seemed to lean back, stretching after the night's delicate exertions, preparing to welcome the first light with a calm, unspoken patience. And yet, even in this quiet, the floating world never truly slept. Alleyways remained ready for those few who moved with purpose. Scholars seeking a secret mentor, apprentices carrying rare inks and silks, or courtesans practicing a gesture that would speak volumes in a single glance. The rhythm of Kaifeng was eternal, gentle, deliberate, and alive. It was a city that existed not merely for those who dwelled within it, but for those who could enter its grace with quiet awareness, who could notice the unspoken beauty in a lantern's sway, a brushstroke's curve, or the faintest trill of a guqin in the morning mist. By the time the first golden threads of sunlight touched the palace roofs, the floating world had already begun to fold in upon itself. Daylight would bring merchants, clerks, and the bustle of markets, but the hidden heartbeat of Kaifeng, its poetry, music, and soft conspiracies, remained, awaiting the return of night. And so, the city breathed, alive in shadow and lantern light, a world of elegance and quiet enchantment, where every moment, no matter how small, could be savored like the perfect sip of tea. Before the sun fully rose, the floating world of Kaifeng shifted into a quieter rhythm, one invisible to the casual eye. Lanterns had been lowered, but the faint glow of jade and red glass still lingered on the edges of alleyways, painting the morning mist in delicate color. Courtesans moved silently along these paths, their steps measured, their robes whispering against the stones like a secret only the city could hear. In the tea-houses, apprentices unlocked the shutters, revealing carefully stacked cushions and meticulously arranged trays. The scent of barley tea and osmanthus, faint overnight, began to swell with warmth, drifting across the empty courtyards. A lone calligrapher traced symbols on delicate silk, her brush hovering with hesitation, then moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the strokes themselves carried the city's secrets. Every line, every curve, was a lesson whispered across generations, a subtle code only the attentive could read. The courtesans, meanwhile, gathered in small chambers behind screens carved with plum blossoms and phoenixes. Here, away from patrons, they taught each other more than music, dance, or calligraphy. They shared strategies for reading patrons, subtle expressions, fleeting gestures, and even the scent of perfume. A raised brow, a paused hand, the faintest intake of breath, all could signal intention, desire, or caution. These lessons were not merely art. They were the politics of survival, the quiet intelligence of a society that thrived in secrecy. Messages moved through the floating world in invisible currents, a folded note tucked into a tea tray, a whispered phrase across a courtyard, or a single knot tied in a silk cord. All could convey instructions, warnings, or opportunities. Some courtesans acted as discreet intermediaries, carrying delicate secrets between officials, merchants, and scholars. No one spoke openly of this undercurrent. It existed in gestures and pauses, in the soft patter of steps across stone, and the gentle clink of porcelain cups. Even the waterways participated in the silent communication. Small boats glided past bridges, carrying scrolls sealed with wax or messages hidden beneath cushions. The boatmen moved without haste, attuned to the rhythm of lantern light and the city's heartbeat. Mist curled across the canal, softening the shapes of buildings and turning their reflections into liquid poetry. Occasionally, a patronless musician played a few notes on a guqin from the deck of a boat, each vibration carrying across water to announce a signal or simply to honor the calm of early morning. The political subtleties of the floating world were practiced in near silence. Courtesans advised patrons in hushed tones, their words weaving influence into the decisions of merchants and officials who thought themselves in full control. A merchant, swayed by a carefully phrased suggestion, might extend a credit line or alter a shipment without realizing who guided him. A young scholar could find himself accepting a lesson in a new school of thought, his curiosity sparked by a single verse recited over tea. These interventions were gentle, indirect, and almost imperceptible, but in a city where perception shaped reality, they were powerful. Even as daylight brightened the rooftops, the courtesans' eyes remained observant. In their chambers they discussed news carried by passing patrons or glimpsed through hidden courtyards. Who had been seen arriving late at the port? Which merchant had grown suspiciously cautious? Which scholar lingered too long over a particular scroll? Every observation mattered, adding a layer to a network of information that stretched across the floating world. Knowledge was both currency and art, traded delicately through subtle gestures, careful phrasing, and the shared understanding that to know was to wield power. By mid-morning, the first patrons arrived, government clerks seeking a moment of quiet before their offices filled with paperwork, scholars returning to continue debates over new verses, or travelers following whispered directions to a particular tea-house or performance. The courtesans, poised and graceful, shifted seamlessly from the secret world of politics and guidance to the visible world of service and art. Their influence moved like water, unseen yet shaping every path it touched. In Kifeng, early morning was not merely a prelude to the day. It was a time of preparation, subtle instruction, and hidden orchestration, when the city's true heartbeat pulsed beneath lantern-lit streets and misty canals. Those who walked its paths with patience, attentiveness, and respect could sense it, a world of soft power, delicate conspiracies, and artistry that moved not only the body, but the mind and heart as well. And as the sun climbed higher, the floating world transformed once more, folding its secrets carefully behind screens and lanterns, waiting patiently for night to return, for the poetry, music, and whispered influence to rise again. As dusk deepened over Kaifeng, the city transformed again. Lanterns flared to life with a practiced choreography, their soft glow spilling across jade tiles, lacquered railings, and winding canals. The air smelled of roasted barley tea, incense, and a faint tang of river water, carrying the subtle notes of hidden conversations and quiet schemes. Merchants closed their shutters, travelers paused at bridges, and the courtesans readied themselves for the night, stepping into roles that demanded equal measures of artistry and discretion. The evening was the time of alliances and rivalries, subtle yet precise. Tea houses became neutral grounds, places where city officials, guild masters, and courtesans negotiated, observed, and exchanged coded messages. Words were careful, gestures measured, glances heavy with unspoken meaning. One might hear a merchant's laugh, soft and practiced, while a courtesan's slight bow conveyed instructions that could reroute shipments, avert disputes, or redirect favors. Every cup of tea, every delicately painted scroll, carried intention beneath its surface. Guild rivalries simmered in the alleys and hidden courtyards. The silk weavers, proud of their delicate craftsmanship, quarreled over patronage with the embroidery guild, whose tapestries adorned temples and wealthy estates alike. But in Kaifeng, such disputes were never loud or public. Instead, they were fought with subtlety, a misdelivered shipment, a delayed payment, a favored patron invited elsewhere. The courtesans, skilled in observation, often acted as intermediaries or spies, carrying word of who held influence and who required persuasion. Theaters buzzed with a different energy. Actors and musicians rehearsed secret performances meant for select audiences, weaving political satire into dances, puppet plays, and opera. A jest about a greedy merchant, a veiled reference to a city official, or a carefully staged confrontation between masked figures could influence real-world negotiations without anyone openly declaring the intent. Patrons left these performances with thoughts carefully nudged, ideas planted like seeds in fertile minds. The courtesans understood this language perfectly, passing insights subtly to those who could act. Meanwhile, secret meetings took place in shadowed gardens and quiet courtyards. Lanterns dangled from bamboo scaffolds, their light just enough to illuminate maps, letters, and scrolls laid carefully on low tables. Courtesans acted as couriers, observing who arrived, noting the order of arrival, and delivering information to their discreet patrons. Discussions involved everything from trade agreements and merchant rivalries to the placement of officials, the timing of inspections, and even rumors of arrivals from distant provinces. Each revelation shifted the balance of influence, allowing those with eyes and ears to manipulate outcomes without a sword ever drawn. In the floating world's labyrinthine alleys, the very architecture played a role in these intrigues. Hidden staircases, curtained bridges, and water gates allowed favored individuals to move unseen, while courtesans and apprentices marked entrances and exits with subtle signs. A lantern tilted at a particular angle, a knot tied in a silk sash, or a small token left in a flower arrangement could signal meetings, alert allies to danger, or silently guide decisions. Those who understood the signs moved with confidence. Those who did not remained outsiders, wandering the city as though in a dream that only half understood its rules. Even the music of Kaifeng held dual purpose. Zithers and guqins played melodies pleasing to the ear, but courtesans listened for subtle variations, rhythms that indicated messages hidden in performance. A change in tempo could signal the arrival of a messenger, a soft trill a warning, a drawn-out note a reminder of a favor owed. These cues were never obvious to the casual observer, yet they orchestrated the city's hidden flow of influence. The canals themselves were alive with information. Boats glided silently beneath the moonlight, carrying letters, scrolls, and gifts. Courtesans on bridges watched intently, noting arrivals and departures, the alignment of lanterns signaling safe passage or concealed danger. Even the rivers participated, carrying news from one district to another, whispered in the splash of oars and reflected in the glimmering water. As night deepened, the floating world thrummed with calm yet undeniable tension. Every action had meaning, every glance could convey a plan, every step was choreographed in a delicate ballet of observation, persuasion, and influence. In Kaifeng, pleasure and politics were inseparable, artistry and diplomacy intertwined so tightly that one could not move without affecting the other. Visitors often left with no clear memory of who had guided them, who had watched them, or what had been whispered behind their backs. Yet the city had shifted around them subtly. Decisions had been influenced, rivalries nudged, favors allocated, all without a single sword raised. This was Kaifeng's magic, a floating world where control was gentle, subtle, and entirely invisible, yet profoundly felt by all who lived within its lantern-lit streets. And as midnight approached, the city held its collective breath, poised between dream and reality, ready to repeat the delicate secret dance again for another night. As the hour deepened and the lantern's glow softened to a gentle shimmer, Kaifeng's floating world began to exhale. The laughter slowed, the music softened, and the footfalls on polished cobblestones grew faint. Tea houses closed their shutters, leaving behind trails of incense and the lingering warmth of shared conversation. Curtains swayed in the evening breeze, carrying whispers of poetry and quiet farewells, and the distant rhythm of drums faded into memory. Above, the moon rose like a silent guardian, silvering the roofs, the water, and the winding alleys with a calm, forgiving light. Reflections of lanterns danced on the canals like scattered stars, reminding all who wandered here that even in a city built on intrigue and subtle negotiation, there was a serenity that could be claimed if one simply paused to notice it. Courtesans returned to quiet rooms behind lacquered screens, their day's performances finished, their steps light and unhurried. Scholars folded their scrolls, merchants tucked letters into pockets, and even the stray cat on the bridge curled into the warmth of a lantern-lit corner, eyes blinking slowly as if approving the city's nocturnal meditation. In these moments, the floating world felt timeless. The weight of ambition, rivalry, and secrets softened into a gentle rhythm. One could walk the streets, listen to the water lapping at the canals, breathe in the mingled scent of tea and incense, and feel the city pulse not with haste or demand, but with quiet, deliberate life. Kaifeng at night was a mirror of stillness and reflection, a place where the mind could wander freely, untangling the day's complexities, and where even the most secret thoughts could float like lanterns across the calm water. And as the last candle flickered and the city slipped fully into darkness, there remained only the soft, enduring promise of another dawn, another day of subtle wonder, and the gentle reassurance that in this floating world the night was a friend, not a threat.